Thank you very much. Bonsoir, DEVFEST Toulouse. My name is Erik Rasmussen, and today I'm here to talk to you about really everyone's favorite part of web development, and that is forms, and specifically, forms in React. But before we can get into how forms are inputs or anything, we need to cover the concept of controlled components. Now, the difference between a controlled component and an uncontrolled component is really pretty simple. And I've used my artistic ability here to illustrate it for you. A component is uncontrolled if it manages any of its own state. And a component is controlled if it is just rendering what is being given to it by its props. And obviously, controlled components are going to be easier to test, and they're going to be more predictable because they sort of follow this pattern of your UI is just a function of your props. And sometimes these controlled components go by other names like dumb components or presentational components or things like that. And React best practices recommend using as many controlled components as possible. However, with the uncontrolled components, keep in mind that having state doesn't necessarily mean that it's state managed by React itself. There are certain types of DOM components that have their own state. For example, inputs. So how do we determine whether an input is controlled or not? Well, it comes down to whether or not you pass a value prop. If you pass a value prop, then React will make absolutely certain that that input will always only have that exact value that you give it. And if you don't pass a value prop, then the DOM component is going to feel free to manage the value of that. As you type into it, it's going to keep the value in the DOM element itself. However, the component on the right here is you can bang on the keyboard as hard as you want. It's not going to let you change that value because it's a controlled input. And you might be thinking, this seems like sort of a step in the wrong direction. Why would we use controlled inputs at all? Well, there's several reasons. The React docs recommend it. And this is because React would prefer to control all the state all the time. It would like to be the single source of truth for the state in your application. And really, React would rather you not even ever think about the DOM at all. Like, for example, React abstracts away things like the events into a synthetic event, which helps sort of smooth over browser idiosyncrasies between different browsers. And some React frameworks don't even use the DOM, right? You've got React, which is your components, but then React DOM is the interface into the DOM, but there's also React Native and other things. So let's look at what a controlled input looks like. So this is 2019, so we're going to be using hooks. I hope, does anyone know, have you ever used hooks? React hooks? A little bit? Good. All right. So we start with our useState hook, and that's going to give us a value and a setter for that value. And then we give the value to our input. And then on change, we look at event.target.value to get our value back, and we set the value. So that's the basics. But does anyone see the bug in this code? We didn't give an initial value to useState. So the first render value is going to be undefined, which means that it's going to be an uncontrolled component. And then as soon as you type into it, in dev mode, React is going to give you a console warning saying, hey, you converted an uncontrolled input to a controlled input. You know, what are you doing? You need to pick a strategy here. So all we have to do is provide the empty string as the initial value, and now we're all good. Now, the React docs, this is about as far as the React docs go in giving you guidance on building forms. If Facebook had provided a recommended structure for how to maintain form state, it could have saved us all a lot of time. But they didn't. And I have a little theory about this. I don't know how true this is. But if you think about it, how many inputs does Facebook.com typically have on a given form? This might be the most used form on the entire internet, and there's only one input. I don't know if that's why, but it makes for a good story. So much like Facebook did with Flux and GraphQL, they sort of left forms building up to the community to sort of have a battle and see which ideas rose to the top. Now, for small, simple forms, you can just copy and paste that little bit of input management that I showed previously, and you can get something like this. This is pretty tiny, but the general idea is you've got 3 useState hooks. You pass the value and the setter to each of your inputs, and then on submit, you sort of bundle up those values and send it off to wherever it needs to go. And this is a perfectly fine way to make a small form, like a login form or something like that. And you could even add some required validation logic to prevent submit if all the fields weren't filled out or something like that. But I think you can quickly see that after you get more than 3 or 4 fields, it's going to get kind of messy. And not to mention, just the field values is not the only thing that is form state. So what do I mean when I say form state? Well, obviously you have the field values, but then you have things like which of your fields are valid or invalid, and is your entire form valid or invalid? Same thing goes with dirty or pristine. Dirty means that the value has changed since the form was loaded, and pristine is the opposite. And with your client-side validation, you've got some validation errors. You need to know, are they per field? Do you need to display them next to the field, or are they for the whole form? And you've got things like which field is currently active. Maybe you want to display a little tooltip explaining what the user needs to know to fill out that field. And then you have things like visited and touched. Visited means, has the field ever had focus? And touched means, has it ever had focused and lost focused? And these can be very useful for deciding when to display error messages, for example. And like modified has the value ever changed at all? And then, of course, when you get to submitting, now that we submit everything with Ajax, you need to show a little spinner or gray out the submit button or something. And then when the submission gets back, did the submit succeed? Did the submit fail? Do we have submit errors? Is it for the whole form, like your login failed, or is it for individual fields? And if you're displaying a submit error for an individual field, then when the user goes to fix it, maybe you need to know if the field has changed since it was last attempted to be submitted. So, like I say, form state is all of this stuff. And it, why would you need a form library? It's pretty easy. You can manage all that, right? And so remember how I said that Facebook sort of let the community sort things out? Well, the first form library that really took hold in the React community was one that I wrote called Redux Form. Who's used Redux Form here? Mm-hmm. It's very common. To this day, it's one of the most downloaded form libraries with 1.6 million downloads every month. And every conference I go to, everyone says, oh yeah, I use Redux Form. And I wrote Redux Form during a time when the React community was still figuring out how to manage application state, where it should live in your application. The context API was still sort of undocumented, and so people were using Redux to handle communication, deep communication through your JSX. And I now feel pretty confident, and I agree with the general consensus that Redux is not the best place to store your form state in global application state. You can, and dispatching an action on every single key press as you're typing can be performant, but it still poses undue stress on the entire system because Redux has to go and ask all of your reducers, hey, do you care about this action? So, I want to talk a little bit about some of the feedback I got from Redux Form, because let me tell you, if you release anything on the internet, you're going to get feedback. So, some of the bits of feedback were, you mean it's only for React? People are using Redux with Angular and other libraries, and if it's just a reducer to manage your form state, why is it only in React? Also, why do I have to use Redux? Maybe I'm using some other application state management solution, and I just want to build a form, and you're making me install this global application framework. it's too much. And why so much re-rendering? Like sometimes if a bit of your form state changes that you don't care about, like say your whole form goes from valid to invalid or something, and you don't necessarily need to re-render the entire form unless you're specifically changing the UI for some reason for that. And last but not least, it is huge. It's over the years of saying, sure, I'll take your use case, sure, I'll make it do that to satisfy your exact need, it sort of suffers from some bloat. And so, and also, why does it need to have all the functionality for the really complicated forms if you're just writing a simple little form? Like you don't need to have all the code to manage arrays of fields and things like that. So I took all of this into consideration and I thought for a bit. And I thought, what would a better form library look like? Well, it'd be great if it was just pure JavaScript. No need for fancy data structures like immutable.js or even helper libraries like Lodash. And what if it could also be framework agnostic? Because if you think about it, form states doesn't need to care what the view layer looks like. Every form is going to have your field values and your valid and invalid and your dirty and pristine, all of this state. So if the core state management engine doesn't necessarily need to know if you're using React or Angular or Vue or web components or whatever 3D virtual reality framework our grandkids are going to be bored at work filling out forms in. And what if it could be subscription-based, meaning that, like with GraphQL, you could specify exactly the bits of state that you want to be notified about when they change, and you wouldn't be bothered from updates from other parts of state. And what if it could be modular, where there was a solid core, but then you could add on bits of functionality to it if you needed a more complex form? So you think of it sort of like the analogy of having a toolbox where you can pick and choose individual tools for whatever your task is, as opposed to carrying around a big Swiss Army knife that they're all just connected together. And after thinking about this, I came up with a solution, and I called it Final Form. Final Form is a standalone form state management engine. It's framework agnostic. It's subscription-based, using the observer pattern, where you subscribe and you tell it exactly what bits of state you want to know about. And it has plugin capabilities, where its behavior can be modified by attaching extra bits to it. It's got 0 dependencies. There's no Lodash. There's none of that stuff. And it weighs in at only 5K gzipped. And although Final Form is framework agnostic, I am not. I have a favorite front-end framework. So I also wrote React Final Form. And React Final Form is simply just bindings to Final Form. It's when the form component mounts, it creates an instance of the form manager and subscribes to changes from it. And it maps the form and the field state to render props. And it also handles React synthetic events. It knows how to get the value out of your React synthetic event. And it also does some logic to make radio buttons and checkboxes work properly using the checked prop. And because it's not doing any of the state management, it's just doing this sort of wrapper functionality, it's even smaller. It's only 3.1K gzipped. So together, they form a React form solution that is 8.1K gzipped. And you might be wondering, how does that compare to other form libraries? Well, good news, I've done that research for you. Not only is React Final Form smaller than all the others, but it even has additional features like keeping track of which field is active that some of the other ones don't. So if bundle size is important to you, and it should be for the sake of your users, then I would strongly consider that you should check out React Final Form for your next form library. Or there's even migration guides from Redux Form and Formic on the docs page. So let's talk about the API. React Final Form consists of two primary components and another specialized component. The first one is the form, which wraps the entire form and provides form and state to a render prop. And then there's field, which registers a field in the containing form and provides field states and your callback functions like onChange and onBlur and onFocus via a render prop. And the third one is something called FormSpy. And this provides a way to read form state from within your form without re-rendering the entire form. And that's a complicated sentence, but hopefully it will become clear what that does later. And, of course, render props are so 2017. We're in 2019 now, so we also have some hooks. We've got the useField hook, which provides all the values that field injects into render props. And we use FormState, which provides all the values that FormSpy can inject for you. And we also have useForm, which just provides the underlying final form instance. And one thing I learned when I refactored React Final Form to use hooks was that, first of all, hooks are a much cleaner way of using a third-party state management thing, because previously I would have to in the constructor, and then on component did mount, and then on component did update. All of these things I would have to be checking the props and going to see if I had to unregister and re-register a field or something like that. But with React useEffect hook, it sort of does all that for you, which is very nice. The bundle size actually went down when I refactored to hooks. But the other thing I learned is that any component that you're using hooks with to inject some state somewhere, you can take all of the code in your component and pull it out into a custom hook and only call that hook. But then if you're publishing a library, you can also publish that hook so that anyone can take any component and turn it into a field or a FormSpy. So I think that's enough talking about the docs. I think it's time to see what happens if we do some live coding. So okay. Is this font big enough? Bigger? Oops. And you can make it bigger. Okay. So we're going to build a form right quick. And the way we do that is we import form and field. And here we're going to start with our form. And the only thing that form requires is onSubmit. And that is what you do with the values when the form is submitted. The library doesn't care if you want to save it to local storage or send it off to a server somewhere, whatever. And I've got a onSubmit thing that's just going to wait 100 milliseconds and alert the values that we give it. And this form takes a render prop as a child. I hope you have seen the light on why that's a common practice now. And one of the things that it is given is a handle submit function, which is designed to be given directly to onSubmit of the HTML form. Okay, and we need curly here. So let's make a row here and make a field. So here, rather than put an input, we're going to put a field. Oops. And we give it a name for a field. And to start off with, we're going to use this shortcut where you can pass a component string that is one of the HTML components. If you've used Redux form, this API is going to look pretty familiar. And let's see if we have a form. OK, we have a one field. Let's add a submit button. And I like having a placeholder. OK, so if we type in here, we hit submit, it waits for a second, and alerts our values. OK, let's just, while we're developing, let's print out our values here. Now, where are our values? Our values are one of the things that are injected by the form. We also get submitting. Let's use that too, and we can like disable the submit button when we're submitting. Okay, so now we get our values printed out down here, and as we type, we can see our values are changing. And when we submit, our submit button gets grayed out, although you can't really see that very well. So let's add a couple more fields, because we're not Facebook. We need more than one field. And let's see, go with last name. And email. All right, so we have our three fields here, and as we type in them, we get our thing. But we can submit even if we haven't filled out all of our values. So we might need some validation. This is a typical thing that you would need to do. Now, there's two types of validation with React Final Form. There's what I call record level validation and field level validation. Record level is you have to give it a validation function that takes the whole object of all your form values, and if any of them are invalid, you return an object of errors where the keys match the keys of the invalid values. And the field level validation is you can pass like a validate function here that just takes the one value of that field and either returns undefined if it's valid or an error if it's not. But for this demonstration, we're going to use record level validation. And if we return the empty object, then it's valid. So we can say like if our value first name is falsy, then errors dot first name was required. All right, so now all of our fields are required. So if I hit the submit button, nothing happens. But if I type something into every one of the fields, then I'm able to submit. So this is great and all, but the user doesn't know why the submit didn't work. We have to display the error somewhere. And the way we do that, that is part of field state, the error for a given field. So we need to get that out of the field component. Oops. And what we're going to do is we're going to make a copy of this field component here. And we can't use this shortcut of a component equals input. We're going to need to use the render props. So this is going to give us field state. And what are we going to do with it? For now, let's print it out like we're doing with the values. Oops. OK. So all of this is the field state that React Final Form is managing for us. OK? Let's make that a little bit bigger. The important thing to note is that it's broken into two primary sections. Input is all of the information that you need to give to your actual HTML input component, like your name and your value. But what stringify doesn't print out here is you also have your onChange and onBlur and onFocus callbacks are all in this object here. And if we use type equals checkbox, then there might be a checked value as well. And then we have meta. This is all the stuff that would be hard to use to track on your own using a useState hook, for example. So we've got active, which is whether or not the current field is active. We've got dirty, which hasn't changed since it was initialized. And just for convenience, I pass pristine as well. Those are always going to be opposites, but sometimes it's easier to think about your code without having to say not dirty when you mean pristine. Same goes for valid and invalid. And we also have this thing, and we also have our visited and touched. Visited, as I mentioned, is have you ever given the field focus, and touched is have you given the field focus and taken it away. And that remains true for the lifetime of the component. And look, we also found where our error lives. It's under meta.error. So let's watch how this field, and the other thing to note is that any additional prop that you pass to field that isn't part of the field API is going to get passed along to you. So you can just pass anything in here, and it'll show up down here. This is really useful if you have some custom component that needs extra config information. So let's interact with this input and see what happens to our input state. So when I focus on this input, what's going to happen? Well, active is going to become true, and visited is going to become true, because once it's been visited once, then that becomes true. So if I give focus, active became true, and visited became true. Now, notice that even though we have no value for first name, React Final Form, because it is special for React, is providing the empty string, so we don't have that controlled input bug. So as I type in this field, what's going to happen? Well, the value is going to change. Dirty is going to become false. Pristine is going to become true. Dirty is going to become true. Pristine is going to become false. And our error should go away because we're just checking if there's anything in the string, which means valid and invalid are going to switch too. So watch. I've typed in here, and dirty is true. Our error went away. Pristine is false, and valid is now true. And when I blur, active is going to become false, and touch is going to become true. Let's see if that happens. OK, so this sort of gives you a feel for how this field state is flowing through your application as you're using it. And it also lets us know how we're going to be able to display our error message. So let's go back over here. And what I always like to do is with our field state, I like to destructure that into our input in meta. And here we are going to, let's just render the whole div. So we're going to take that there. And here, rather than our field, we're going to put our input. And this is where it comes in very handy that all of these values are in their own little object, because we can use the React prop spread. Oops. And that's all we have to do to connect our input to React Final Form. It's going to get the name and the value and all the callbacks and things. And we'll go ahead and put our placeholder here too. First. And we could have taken our placeholder as it was back down here, out of here, but it doesn't really matter. So we can remove our placeholder here. No. OK. So now we should have two first names. So we can take away this whole row here. And now we have, let's see if it still works. All right, so we're still modifying our value, but we're not doing anything with the error yet, right? So the error, as we remember, was in meta.error. So here we can say if meta.error then print out a span with meta.error. So now our error is being printed out, but it's being printed out when the form first renders, and that's a little bit antagonistic to our user to already be upset with them when they just loaded the page. It'd be much nicer to have them go through the form, and if they do make a mistake, then to tell them. So that's why we have this nice touched. So this way, I don't see the error, but if I go to the field and I leave the field, then it's going to be displayed. So let's go ahead and replicate this for our other fields. That was one. Last name and email. All right, so now as we tab through our field, through our forms, the errors are going to be displayed as it comes along. And the other nice thing about using touched is that when we try and submit and we have validation errors, React Final Form is going to go ahead and mark all of our fields as touched. So if we try and submit, all the errors are going to appear. Okay, so now I want to talk about what really sets React Final Form apart from the other form libraries, and that is this ability to control how often your stuff re-renders. Now, for the vast majority of forms, you don't need to do this. Premature optimization, blah, blah, blah. But it's because I came at this library from a really popular library where I knew there were many people that had 500 fields on a page. From the beginning, I wanted to build in this ability to fine-tune the form in the future. So that's why I added this subscription-based system. So I have a little helper. It's going to help us with this. This is just a little component that prints out however many times it itself has been rendered. So we can put one of these guys in here, and we're going to put one next to each field too, so we can see. Oops. And we're going to throw one down here in our values. Okay. So these little circles here represent how many times this is, the top one is for the whole form and for the individual fields, and this is for the values down here. So let's say we had a really big form, and watch what happens as I type into the field. Okay, so the whole form and all the fields are being re-rendered. So the way we can get around this is by using this subscription prop both to form and field. So the subscription prop takes an object of booleans. So you specify, like you're picking individual things off a menu, which bits you want to be notified about. And we can clearly see here the 2 bits of state that we're using. Values and submitting. Okay, and now for each field, we need to find subscription, which bits of field state we're using. Well, we're using touched and error. And while it's not immediately obvious from this, we're also using value. If we did not subscribe to value, we would have a hard time filling out our field. So let's add this to our other fields. Okay, so now when I focus on this field, it didn't re-render because it became active, because we're not subscribing to active. But say we did want to do something with active, we can go tell it active true. Okay, thank you, VS Code. and say we wanted to like meta.active. Say we wanted to change the class name on the whole row or something. We can do that down here. And here. I've introduced a bug just now. But now, so now when we click on, when we give focus to first name, it is, the whole row is rendered again, but nothing else has. Now, when I move the focus to the other ones, it's not highlighting, and that's because we forgot to subscribe to active, so it was not being notified of the change, but now it will be. Okay, so now our fields are only going to be re-rendered when they change, and our form is only be re-rendered when something it cares about changes. So we'll watch what happens when I type here now. Okay, so all the fields are re-rendering. So there's a problem here. And that problem is the way we're getting our values here is from the form render prop. So it's re-rendering the whole form, and as it does that, each of the fields has to as well. So we have to substitute with the form. We can't subscribe to values. Okay? Now when we type into our thing, very nice. So only that field that I'm typing into changes. And as I keep typing, the form has only re-rendered the first time, but we lost our values down here. So somehow we need a way to get our form state from within our form without re-rendering the entire form, which you may recall was what FormSpy does. So we can use FormSpy here, and it also takes a subscription. And we can say, hey, we just want to know about values. And you're going to give us values, which we can wrap around this guy. And now we have our values again. So now when I type into this? It's re-rendering only this values part every time that the values change. The whole form is only rendered the one time, and each field is only rendering when it needs to re-render. And then when I hit submit, the whole form is going to re-render because we're subscribing to submitting. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of if you need to, in the extreme case, you're going to be happy if you chose this library over another because you get that real fine-tuned control. But let's get rid of these render counts. So what about hooks? What's this use field hook good for? Well, what it's not good for, like you can't come up here in your component that's rendering the whole form and be like use field, blah, blah, blah. Because this use field has to be called from inside this entire form thing here. So what you can do is you can have your own form components. So for example, if we wanted to have, say we wanted to have an error component that renders only our an error for a given field. So it could take the name, and then it could call use field with a name, and then we could say return. So this is going to have our meta and our input in it. So we could say meta.touch and meta.error. Then we could render our span with our error. And it's going to turn this error component into something that can display that. So running low on time here, I'm going to go back briefly to another slide here. OK, so we survived the live coding. I want to talk a little bit about how to choose a form library, or any library, really. You need to think about how complex the problem is. If it's just a simple little 2-input form, then you don't really need to install a whole library. But if you have a longer, complex sign-up form or something that you need validation with, then you're going to need, you might want to pick a battle-tested solution from NPM. And how extensible is it? Like your requirements might be small to begin with, but you're going to have feature creep. Your requirements are going to grow. And how well does it look like a particular library is going to be able to meet those needs? And one way to know about this is to look at the examples that are available. There are many reasons to like Next.js, but my favorite is the large list of examples in the repo. There's, for all the CSS and JS libraries, for all the Node web servers, there's an example of how to use it with Next. And that gives me, as a consumer of Next, the confidence that no matter how my requirements change, they're going to be there for me. Similarly, React Final Form has, at this time, it has 41 different examples of common use cases. And these are all these use cases that I learned from maintaining Redux Form that are things that I know that might come up. So there are examples of how to do each of them. Also, are the docs legible? React Final Form did not have very good docs until just this summer when I created a docs website for it. And there's where you will find your migration guide from other form libraries. And also, you got to remember this graph a little bit. Other libraries might be a little bit fatter, but do just as well. It's just a thing to consider. If you're right on the fence, then you should go with a lighter library. And notice I'm not saying anything about GitHub stars or NPM downloads. Those tend to, your older libraries are going to have more of those than your younger libraries, and I don't think it's a really good metric. As long as you've got a couple thousand NPM downloads a month, you know the thing's being used and is going to be looked after. And finally, the most important thing is just, does the library make sense to you? Do you understand what's going on under the hood, and does it feel like the way that you want to build your website? And with that, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.